Hi there. Welcome to this week's Form Drawing Friday video. In today's video, I want to show you the band that we did last week again, and talk a little bit about the 4 stages in form drawing that Rudolf Kutzli talks about in his book, Creative Form Drawing. So this is the band as we created it last week. Form drawing in Kutzli's book, he says, is about creating an inner awareness of form relationship. So when we practice form drawing, the aim is to achieve a balance in the forms and harmony, and to keep the movement alive, which is why I've talked about rhythm, and which is also why we're not really trying too hard to get the form looking absolutely perfect. Because if you imagine that the form is absolutely perfect, is mirrored, if this first part of the form is mirrored perfectly in this second part of the form, something of the movement becomes dead, if you like, is a bit stale. It loses a bit of life. Obviously, we want it to be harmonious and we want it to look good, but we don't want it to be like a computer drawing where it's so perfect that, it's almost like we've drawn it with a ruler or just simply flipped the image. That's very important, because it's this inner sensing of the lines and of the movement that it's all about when we do our form drawing. In fact, Kutzli, in his book, Creative Form Drawing, in the first workbook, which is the one we're using, he says the aim in practicing is to achieve a certain balance in the form, a harmony, and at the same time taking special care to keep the flow of the movement alive. And that is this thing about rhythm as well. And then he says, finally, you'll be able to form the impulse of the line expressively by a kind of touching. So he's basically talking about weighing up as the first step in the process, and then moving as the second step, and then ordering as the third step, and touching as the fourth step of the process in terms of when we practice our form drawing. And he says, when you're going through these 4 stages, then you'll feel the relationship to musical practicing. And in fact, in one of the comments we had, someone mentioned to me that he or she regarded it as a kind of musical dance for the hand when you do form drawing. So the balance here is that we, first of all, obviously, we want to copy the line that we see in the book. And then once we've copied the line, and once we no longer need to look in the book, we now know that this is what the line should look like, and we know that, this is the rhythm that I'm creating. I'm going fast in the release, and then I'm slowing down in the bind, and fast in the release, and slowing down in the bind, and fast in the release, slowing down in the bind, fast in the release, slowing down in the bind, fast in the release. Once we're no longer using mental power. We're no longer thinking our way through the band. We're sensing the movement. We're sensing the line. It comes from an inner impulse, if you like. Then we can start doing what Kutzli talks about as the touching of the line. And my interpretation of the touching that he talks about is basically that we're forming the line expressively, sort of playfully. He's also referring to it musically, so it's using the term playfully, I think works quite nicely. So here we're drawing the line. I'm drawing the line as it looks in the book. And of course you can go over your line again and again. And I would absolutely encourage you to do that until you think now it looks nice. Adjusted if you feel, oh, it got a bit too high, it wasn't really round enough here, going back over the line, and just, making sure that you think that now it's looking sort of good. So once you're feeling confident with your line, then you can see here that in the book, this basically looks the way it looks in the book. The middle section here, the middle little rounded bit here, is slightly lower than the two binds. And the two binds, the two vertical binds, are slightly lower in height as well to the two rounded shapes either side of them. And the rounded shapes, their loops are roughly the same height. So this is the way it looks in the book. Now, if we were to, for instance, think, you might have been thinking, well, for me to practice this band, I'm going to practice the way that we've done previously in the other exercises, which means that, the binds and the releases, they should be the same height, because they have been. And I've sort of mentioned that, you could do your help lines in previous exercises, and then your lines, the tops and the bottoms of your band would be in line with each other. But once we start doing the touching, which Kutzli talks about, then this band, although it is harmonious, and you can do it rhythmically, so you can easily do this band by speeding up in the release and then slowing down in the bind, and speeding up in the release and slowing down in the bind, taking care that your bind comes up high and meets your tops of your two shapes here. Then once you're doing this, then you're balancing and you're making it harmonious. However, it's in musical terms a little bit flat. There's no crescendo and there's no diminuendo, I think it's called. I'm not very good with musical terms, so I had to look those up in order to use them properly in this video. But I'll try and show you what I mean. So if we're going to work with this band more playfully, more musically, if we were going to try and create a crescendo and diminuendo, then a band like this would look something like this. So the idea here is, as you can see, that the loop is actually the biggest part, or highest part. And then moving into the next shape, the little hill here, which is lower than our loop. And then we're making sure that the bind doesn't come up as high as the previous hill. And the valley of the bind, the valley that we're going into here, is not coming down as far, it's not coming down quite as far as you can see as the actual bind either. And then the bind comes down far, and then the next hill kind of rises above the bind. And then when we go into our loop at the other end here, again it rises above the hill that we've just come from. And then we have our intersecting line going back the way. And here our hill that intersects with our valley doesn't come up in line either with the bind here. It stays below the bind line. So then that's not as high. And then our bind here we come out of, and then back into the big loop. Now this is roughly, not 100%, this could go a bit lower and then come up, but this is roughly the same line. So it roughly has a base to sit on for the music to sort of sit on here. But if you imagine this as a piece of music, then you might have your orchestra. You'd have your orchestra, your large band orchestra, playing a piece of classical music, and you have a crescendo here, which is just diminishing, going into a diminuendo, like falling in intensity. And then we have our dolce here in the center, which is just a small bit. And then that slightly from our dolce, we slightly go into, we start rising towards a crescendo again. So this is a much more interesting piece of music, I hope you can see, than this is. So this is harmonious and this is balanced, but this is playful. And as you can see, the other thing I want to point out is, or last thing I want to point out is that this end bit isn't 100% the same as this end bit here. I mean, yes, it loops around, but this has a little bit of a top at the end, where this is slightly flatter, and that's okay. That is what I think Kutzli would say keeps the movement alive. So we're not aiming to create a band which is absolutely symmetrical, which looks absolutely the same if you take one half and turn it over onto the other half. It's okay that there are some differences, and here there's a bit more of a top and this is a bit flatter. So that's the lesson for this week's Form Drawing Friday, is that when you've practiced lots and lots and lots and you feel confident with your band and with your rhythm and with your balance, then you can start then the touching, or being what I think I would prefer to call it, playful with your band, and actually start playing with maybe having small loops at the end and a larger middle bit. So what would that look like? That's something you can play with. That's being playful. So I hope that you've enjoyed this week's lesson, and next week I'll be back with a new lesson for you, and it will be completely different, and maybe some will think a lot easier. So I hope to see you next week for a new exercise.